And we are recording. Thanks for starting that. So welcome to the joint program of Rutgers Marine Extension Seminar Series program and Earth Day Every Day. My name is Sal Mangiafico. I work for Rutgers Cooperative Extension. And I did want to mention some of our other partners, some of whom are online tonight, putting this program together. That includes Michelle Bacchus, Amy Rowe, Steve Yerjo, and Doug Zemeckis, all from Rutgers University. The theme of our series this season is all the small things with big environmental impacts. Just a few logistical matters. As I mentioned, we are recording this webinar tonight. If you do have questions, you can put them into the Q&A, and that will look like sort of two speech bubbles. So the chat is disabled, but you can put your questions into the Q&A and we'll wrangle them and get them addressed probably towards the end of the program. Also, near the end of the program, I am going to start a poll that has some questions for you about what you learned during the program. So I'll announce when we do that, but if you would, please complete that when we get there. So as part of this program tonight, we're going to have that poll that I just mentioned. So the first question will be if you consent to take part of the study. Because the university considers that research, simply asking your opinions on these things, you will consent to being part of that research. We keep the information confidential and you can choose not to participate if you would like to. And you can go on to the next slide, please. And of course, Rutgers Cooperative Extension, in coordination with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, is an equal opportunity program provider. So if you'd like more information about that, there is a phone number there you can contact, or you can contact someone at the university, one of us, or someone else for more information about that. So tonight, I am very happy to introduce Heather Nix from Clemson University, Clemson Extension in South Carolina. So she covers regional and statewide issues as a water resource agent for Clemson. Her main focus is sustainable water resources, including improving water quality and assisting with water use planning to ensure plentiful, clean water for future generations. Heather promotes understanding of critical water resource management issues, such as harmful algae blooms, pond management, and water withdrawal regulations. Previous to being with Clemson, Heather has had other positions focused on water resources, including with Greenville Water, which is the largest drinking water utility in South Carolina, helping to protect the water supply for more than 500,000 people. Heather joined Clemson in 2019 and has many publications, including technical manuals and other extension materials, blogs, magazines, and newspaper articles. And with that, I will let Heather begin. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Heather.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate y'all having me here tonight, and I'm glad to be talking to you about harmful algal blooms. And just to make sure you can hear me okay and slides are all working all right. Okay. Well, great. Well, you're probably not a stranger to know that harmful algal blooms have become more common across the country, and they've made a lot of headlines nationwide and in New Jersey quite a few times during the last few years. But there are still a lot of people that maybe aren't entirely sure what a harmful algal bloom is, or what to look for, or what to do once they see one. Hopefully when you leave tonight, you'll have a better idea about all of those things. So harmful algal blooms, also known as HABs, basically interfere with our use of water. And across the country, HABs can be used a little bit differently. So the way that I'm going to talk about it is as an umbrella term. And there are three main ways that HABs can interfere with the use of water. HABs include algal blooms that can physically interfere with use of water. This is an example from a lake in South Carolina where there was this large bloom that physically interfered with boats moving through the water. It threatened to clog water intakes of two large manufacturing facilities that depended on that lake water for their operations. And the rumor is that the bloom was so thick that turtles could walk across the surface of the algal mat. The next way that we'll talk about that HABs can interfere with our use of water is that they include a type of algae that produce compounds that make water taste and smell bad to humans. One example of this is geosmin, which is noticeable to humans at very low levels. Once it's present, it causes taste and odor issues that can be very difficult and expensive to manage. The water is still safe to drink, but it's not ideal, and in some cases it's nearly unusable. The benchmark in South Carolina is if you can still make sweet tea with it, it's okay, but if you can't, if you can still taste the geosmin after that, then it's really just unacceptable. The third group of harmful algal blooms are capable of producing toxins that can be harmful to wildlife, livestock, pets, and humans. And this one is the main one that we'll focus on tonight. So this category includes cyanobacteria. These are also sometimes called cyanoHABs, and throughout most of the rest of the presentation, if I say HABs, I'll be mainly talking about cyanobacteria. Here are a few examples of the warnings and some of the impacts that we've seen over the years. There are a lot of reported pet and livestock deaths that have been attributed to cyanobacteria exposure. We've also seen wildlife deaths. One of the fairly recent example that made headlines back in 2020 was when over 300 elephants died in Botswana, and they traced it back to cyanobacterial poisoning. There are also some reported human deaths. One example is from the late 90s when 76 people died in Brazil after receiving dialysis with water that was contaminated with cyanotoxins. So the consequences of cyanobacteria are pretty serious. It's really important that as we see them more frequently, that people begin to know more about them. And a lot of times we get the question, well, why don't we just take care of, like, kill, wipe out all of the cyanobacteria? Well, they've actually been around so long that we need to talk about their history in geologic time. With fossils dating back about 3.5 billion years, they're some of the oldest organisms on Earth. They have survived through many different things, and they have learned how to compete in really creative ways. There are many different types of cyanobacteria, and they're present in nearly all water bodies. So it's unlikely that we are going to wipe them out, and they're actually a really important part of a balanced ecosystem. So typically we only become concerned with them when they start dominating and growing in an uncontrolled way. There are a few contributing factors that are the main drivers of cyanobacteria growth, and especially when they start to get out of control. So nutrients are a main driver, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus are typically the ones of most interest. And of course, nutrients are essential, but we're talking about when there are higher levels that they really can cause some significant issues. The second driver is sunlight and warm temperatures. We tend to use 77 degrees Fahrenheit as a water temperature, as that's when we start to really see harmful algal bloom cyanobacteria start to really thrive. They can certainly grow at cooler temperatures, but that's when we really start to see them dominate. And then the last one would be stagnant water. So if you have a water body that either has very slow or low flow that moves through it, so the water tends to sit more often. A lot of times if we are in drought, you may have less flow through a water body. And so when that water starts to stagnate, that's when also we would typically see a lot more problems with cyanobacteria. The combination of cyanobacteria's preferred conditions, again, sunlight, warm temperatures, and those lower water levels, means that we tend to see them dominate during summer and into fall, but they certainly can happen outside of that range as well, and they do. I was reading a story about a bloom in New Jersey, I think that happened in October of last year, so that's pretty far outside of what we have historically thought of as its dominant period. So what to look for? Well, cyanobacteria blooms are often described as looking like spilled paint or pea soup, but there are different species of cyanobacteria and they can actually look fairly different. Here are some of the more common species, and we've got everything from that kind of spilled paint look to grass clippings that look like they're floating on the water to what might appear to be a heavy layer of pollen on top of the water body. So those are all different types of cyanobacteria blooms. And then if you start getting multiple species of cyanobacteria, they can also look very different. So instead of just looking like a combination of like spilled paint and grass clippings on top of it, you might get something very different. So if you see a water body that, just gives you that red flag, assume that it could be a cyanobacteria bloom. And that's something certainly to keep in mind. Another fairly common cyanobacteria species is Lingbia, and this one looks fairly different from the other types as well. It often grows deeper in the water column, so it may be largely invisible until often a large mat of it will rise to the surface. So sometimes we get calls from people and they say, my pond was free of aquatic plant growth yesterday, and now the whole thing is covered with a bloom. And that's kind of a red flag for us that it may be Lingbia that they're dealing with. But the only way to confirm a cyanobacteria bloom is to have a sample analyzed. Typically, that involves using some type of equipment. It can be as basic as just a microscope to take a close look at the cells and start to identify what type of cells they are. If you're in New Jersey and you suspect a cyanobacteria HAB in a publicly owned or publicly accessible water body, you should report it to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. They've really simplified this online process. You can submit a report directly from your phone while you're standing on the site. They're going to ask you a few basic pieces of information, the location, a description of the bloom, where it's located, and then they would like some pictures of it if you're able to upload those. That helps them be able to start to identify it. If you don't want to report it while you're out on the site, you can also bring some pictures back, collect that information while you're there, and then you can submit it from your computer at home. Just make sure and don't forget to click the submit button after you filled out all the information. Once they get a report, that information goes to the DEP staff, and those staff will go out and then investigate to confirm if it is a cyanobacteria bloom or not. They have an online dashboard that shows where the reports are and also where their confirmed blooms are located throughout the state. You can see in the map in the middle, each of the dots represents a reported suspected harmful algal bloom. And the different colors indicate if it was a bloom. The green indicates that it turned out not to be a cyanobacteria bloom. And then the different colors indicate the level of risk or concern that might be associated with that. And we'll talk about those advisory levels in just a minute. New Jersey also hosts an annual Harmful Algal Bloom Summit to review the findings from their previous year. Here's a snapshot of the water bodies that they investigated for HABs in 2022, and it shows the highest alert recorded for that station. So if the color on there is orange, it means the highest alert for that particular station in 2022 was the orange alert. Now you can see that they are spread mostly throughout the state. There are a few areas with no or with very few even reported suspected HABs. And if we look at a trend over the last 6 years or so, we can see that there is an upward trend with them. They are increasing. And overall, there were 89 reports of suspected HABs, and then there were 65 confirmed HABs in New Jersey in 2022. And this again is an increase in both the number of reports and confirmations of HABs from previous years. So as more people learn about the reporting system and learn what HABs are, it's not surprising that the number of reported suspected HABs would increase, and that also would likely result in more actual confirmed HABs as well. Okay, touching on the advisory levels. So again, they're based on the seriousness of the bloom, and they're intended to help communicate that level of concern and then what activities, if any, are safe at that time in that specific water body. So once you move in, so the green is obviously, again, the HAB is not present. It's not a cyanobacteria species. Once you do have a confirmed cyanobacteria species, then you would move into potentially that watch level. That's the first level, and it just simply means that there is a confirmed cyanobacteria bloom. The levels are not particularly high or of a concern yet. They will continue to monitor it, and those levels will change if the advisory level will change if the levels in the water body actually changes as well. And you can see that they've tried to make it very simple to understand what activities might be no concern at all. You can see the two with the green check marks. Those are activities that you're a little bit more removed from the actual contact or with the water body. And then we've got several that you're more in contact with the water body. At this blue level, those are a use caution. So you might want to watch for it. And if it seems like it is in the area where you're thinking about swimming, you may want to not swim that day. And then the ones that are marked with the red X are ones that they would advise against doing. So those would be the ingestion type activities. The next level up would be advisory level, and you can see that now some of the contact recreation, the kind of primary recreation activities have moved into the advised against category. Well, there are still some that are use caution or would be okay. Beyond that, you'd move up into the warning level. At that point, there are fewer activities that they would suggest doing, and they even become kind of a use caution even when you're out on the water body if you're not planning on contacting the water directly. And then the last one that they have is the danger category, and I didn't see any that were marked this for 2022. I don't think that there are any hidden on the map there. So I thought I heard someone say that they have not had to use this one yet, which is great, and hopefully that will continue. So when we look at cyanobacteria, there are sort of two things that we're concerned about. One would be the density and the number of cyanobacteria cells in general. And then the other would be, are they producing cyanotoxins? So the cyanotoxins are probably the larger concern there. And what we don't fully understand, sometimes cyanobacteria cells produce a few toxins and they might hold them within their cell membrane itself. Sometimes they produce more toxins, and sometimes they'll release some of those toxins. Now, there are some conditions that we are pretty aware of when they will release those toxins, for example, when the cells die, but there are other conditions that we don't yet understand all of the triggers for why those toxins may be produced or released. Research is starting to find that it appears that phosphorus might really spur the cell growth. So you would have an increase in the cyanobacteria bloom size or density. And then nitrogen may be responsible for the increased production of those cyanotoxins. But again, there may be other triggers, there may be other factors going on that we don't fully understand yet. So when we see that visual evidence of a cyanobacteria cell, it's important that we take some precautions and make sure that we're protected. Now, the reason that we're so concerned with cyanotoxins is that there are several different types of cyanotoxins, and within each of these categories, there are also multiple cyanotoxins that can be produced. Different species may produce multiple of cyanobacteria, may produce multiple types of cyanotoxins. So it does get a little complicated to try to figure out. You can't just, it's not a one for one. If you have this cyanobacteria, you'll have this cyanotoxin. It could be a variety of combinations of those. So it's really best to watch for potential symptoms in any people, pets, or livestock that may have had an exposure to cyanobacteria. There are a wide range of symptoms. They can show up within 30 minutes to a couple of hours. They may take a couple of days to show up. Some of the more common symptoms would be that irritation or skin rash from that contact with it, or some potential gastrointestinal issues. If any of these symptoms develop after a potential exposure to cyanobacteria, call your doctor or your veterinarian if it's one of your animals right away and let them know that there's a potential exposure to cyanobacteria. Again, these can be harmful or even lethal. We've had some livestock that reported deaths that were within a few hours of when they had the potential exposure. So it's something that you certainly want to take action fairly quickly in case it is a cyanotoxin poisoning. Now, the US EPA has set health advisory limits for our drinking water. So these aren't regulated levels, but they are health advisory that water utilities use as technical guidance. Many of our conventional water treatment systems typically will remove the lower concentrations of cyanotoxins, and many of our water utilities will monitor the levels really closely, and they may proactively treat their source water to kill cyanobacteria if they start to see any increase in those levels. So our water utilities are often trying to be very proactive in protecting our drinking water supplies. Now, we talked a lot about how you would identify a cyanobacteria HAB, but if you have cyanotoxins and you want to know what the levels of those are, you likely need to have some kind of a professional lab or professional equipment to be able to go out and measure those results. Again, there are multiple cyanotoxins. just because you know what type of cyanobacteria there is, it doesn't necessarily limit the cyanotoxin potential. So you can still have quite a few of those. So that is important. Many of our state agencies, and I'm pretty sure New Jersey DEP has their own internal lab that they can use, or they will often have contracts with a commercial laboratory that can provide those services for them. Okay, so up until now, we've really focused on larger publicly accessible water bodies when the state agency is able to come in and help identify the bloom and help identify the risk level. I get a lot of calls though from people who own land that contains a pond, and that private land ownership and that lack of public access and the smaller water bodies in our case means that our state agency doesn't necessarily have the resources to go out and really help evaluate. We have some preliminary estimates in South Carolina that we have over 80,000 small ponds. And so there's just, it's just kind of an overwhelming number to think about a state agency helping with all of that. So there are some other options, and I wanted to talk about these for people who may either own land that has a pond located within it. Maybe you're part of an HOA or some other smaller organization that there's not that publicly accessible property to the water body, but you may still be concerned about a harmful algal bloom or cyanobacteria bloom. So again, the only way to confirm if it's a cyanobacteria bloom is by looking at it under a microscope. And so there are several university labs, including Rutgers. Their plant diagnostic laboratory can accept samples, and I've communicated with them a little bit. I believe that they also can confirm if it is a cyanobacteria species or not. We do have Clemson's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic. They do take out-of-state samples, and so if that was something that you were interested, you could, I think, use either of those university labs. And then there also are pond management professionals. So in many cases, and this may be something that you're already working with a professional to help manage your pond over time, or if you're not already and you suspect you have a cyanobacteria bloom, it may be a good time to reach out and contact one and see about moving forward with that. They will be able to help you through multiple parts of this process as we move through this. Now, when you do submit a lab, like if you submit to one of the universities, I know for Clemson, we say it's at least a week or so to get results. It really depends on how many other samples we've received and kind of what the workload is happening right then. So it's not going to be an immediate answer, but we'll start getting you some information over time. Now, if you are going to collect a sample, there are a few kind of common protocols that you probably want to follow. We do have a fact sheet on Clemson's Home and Garden Information Center that outlines some of these instructions. I did run this past the Rutgers lab, and they said, yeah, those are pretty good for what they would want it to be as well. Anytime that you're going to collect a sample or interact with a water body that you suspect has a cyanobacteria bloom, wear gloves, wash your hands after sampling, try to really limit all of your contact as much as possible with that water. It's also a good idea to, once you've collected the sample, wash the outside of the bottle so that it helps protect you and others who may handle that bottle moving forward. Now, we recommend using plastic bottles for these samples, in large part that's simply to reduce the chance of breakage during transport. And then this part is really important, though, that you need to only fill the bottle up to 90% full. So you need to leave at least 10% of the bottle empty, and that empty airspace is really important. So as the cyanobacteria are transported, they are going to continue to produce some gases, and that can build up some pressure in that bottle. So leaving a little bit of airspace in there gives it a little bit of room, but so don't overfill it. And again, plastic if you're planning to transport it, just to reduce breakage for that. Now, fresher samples are better. So if it's possible, collect it the same day that it'll either be dropped off at a lab, or if y'all are able to drop it off at your extension offices, or that you're going to take it to ship. If you're not able to take it the same day, try to keep it cooler. If you're going to have it overnight, usually putting it in the refrigerator is best, but really avoid leaving it like in the sun or in a hot car for very long. And then you'll also want to make sure you fill out the form. You can call the lab first. I apologize. I meant to switch this out with the Rutgers phone number, but we do have their website on here. And so you can go to there and get their form and their contact information. Okay, so that again will take a little bit of time for you to be able to get the results and know if it's confirmed or not. So in the meantime, there are a couple of do-it-yourself tests that will help indicate if it's a HAB or not. Again, the only way to confirm it is through that lab evaluation. So these are simply ones that if you get a positive, it is pretty sure that you have a cyanobacteria bloom, but you can get a false negative. So it's one that you would know you want to be protective around that water body, or you're going to want to move forward with some type of treatment, but you don't necessarily know that it's going to be safe after this test. Now, this first one that I'll talk about is called the stick test. It's really simple. There are instructions available, again, on Clemson's Home and Garden Information Center website. To perform the test, you just take some sort of a stick. It can be literally like a branch, a paddle, a rake, something like that, and you run it through the water and try to pick up the plants. If the stick comes out looking like it's covered in paint, it is likely cyanobacteria. If the stick comes out clean, or it comes out with plants or some kind of stringy vegetation, it may not be cyanobacteria. Now, again, we do have like Lingbia that tends to have that more vascular plant look. And so that one may throw you off a little bit. It may come out with some of that vegetation. So that's one of the reasons why we say this isn't a definitive no. It may be a clearer yes, though. The other do-it-yourself test option that we'll talk about is a jar test. And so for this one, you'll collect a sample in a clear container. It can be plastic, it can be glass. It's not important the material. You're not going to be transporting it a long distance, but having it be clear so that you can see through it is really important. Once you collect that sample, you want to let it sit undisturbed in a cool, dark location. A refrigerator, again, could be a good option for up to about 12 hours or so. Without disturbing the sample, you want to check over time to see if those cells have collected at the surface. If so, it's likely cyanobacteria. Now, sometimes this layer will develop more quickly, maybe in just a couple of hours. I think this one, when we ran this, took about 2 hours for all of the cells to migrate up. And so in that case, we can assume that it's cyanobacteria without waiting those full 12 hours. If it had not already migrated and separated like this, we would have let it continue to run to give it more time to see if it did seem likely to be cyanobacteria. The reason that test works is because some cyanobacteria cells have the ability to move up and down within the water column. That allows them to move to the surface when they prefer the conditions there, but not all cyanobacteria can necessarily do this. So this is why it's more of a definitive yes, but it's not a definitive no when you would do that test. Continuing on in the vein of do-it-yourself tests that you can look at on site, another testing option is a do-it-yourself kit that can be completed on site and will provide rapid results for cyanotoxins. There are a couple of pretty important limitations with this test, though, and there's not just one particular. These are some examples of some of these you can buy online, or they may be available in local stores, but they only test for limited cyanotoxins. So they typically pull some of the ones that are the most common, but they do not test for all of the cyanotoxins. So if you have cyanotoxins that they're not testing for, you might get a low result, but that's not really going to indicate the safety of that water body or not. A couple other things to keep in mind: the person using the kit might not be familiar with water testing, so they could make a mistake in using it. And then conditions can still really rapidly change after you run the test. So within a few hours of when you've taken it, the conditions in the pond could be completely different anyway. There is an important use of when we might want to use these do-it-yourself cyanotoxin kits. And I'll mention that kind of later in the presentation. Also, I mentioned they may not be available at local stores. So if you think you're going to want to have any, you may want to go ahead and purchase some online. And they typically, we've seen them range from about $25 to $35 or so. So while waiting for any of your results on your suspected harmful algal bloom, it's safest to go ahead and assume that that bloom is toxic and keep your people, pets, and livestock away from the water if at all possible. The main exposure routes are by skin, so contact with the water, ingestion, and then also inhalation. So there are a few safety measures that you can take if you do need to be near the water body. We already touched on wearing waterproof gloves if you have to come in contact with the water, and then be sure and wash your hands or boots or anything that you that came in contact with it and that you plan to use again after you've exited the water. You do want to avoid ingesting water or cyanobacteria. Ingestion can be really common with dogs in particular because they likely drink some of the water as they swim. And then when they come out of the water, they may have cyanobacteria that clings to their fur, and they may lick that to clean it off of them. And so that's kind of a direct exposure as well. If you do have an animal that does get exposed and that may have cyanobacteria or cyanotoxins on their fur after they come out of a water body like this, if possible, rinse them down with fresh water as quickly as you can and just try to get that off of them to prevent them from having additional exposure. The last one to mention here is that cyanotoxins can become aerosolized, especially after the water has been stirred up a little bit. So you do want to avoid leaning over the water if you suspect it's a harmful algal bloom or cyanotoxin, I guess in particular, so that you would avoid inhalation of that. Now, in this picture, no judgment on them. This was not a suspected toxin producer, so them leaning over to look at it was not a big deal. Now, if you have livestock that are drinking from a contaminated pond, you'll want to remove them. And this is a pretty big concern that we've heard from some of our livestock producers in the area. And so we focus a few resources kind of to help educate farmers and some of our professionals in particular on what to do with livestock if you suspect a harmful algal bloom. I'm going to keep it pretty brief tonight, but we do have some more materials available if you're interested in this in particular. So basically, if possible, you want to get your livestock onto an alternate water supply and then block their access to the suspected HAB and that water body. Installing a well to provide water in a trough or a tank is a pretty common livestock project. If you're interested in doing this, there may be assistance and funding available to help you. You'd want to contact the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is an arm of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or look for 319 grant projects and plan for this to take 1 or 2 years to work through that process. As you can expect, cost share programs tend to have pretty long lines. There tend to be a lot of people that are interested in them. And then with it being a government cost share program, there's often some paperwork that goes along with that. So knowing that it's going to take a little while to work through that process can be really helpful. This is not an immediate response. If you do have a bloom, it's something more to plan for into the future. If you don't already have an alternate water supply ready for that you can move your livestock to, and there's no other option, you must keep the cattle on the pond with the bloom, you may be able to limit their exposure by moving them to the upwind side of the pond. And that may help avoid exposure to some of those clusters of high toxicity. But if you'll notice, I said the word may and reducing exposure quite a few times. This is just a risk reduction. It is not recommended as a safe practice. And if you have any other option available, we would suggest doing that first. Cyanotoxins don't always stay with the visible cyanobacteria. So again, you're reducing your risk some, but there still is risk. If the wind shifts, that distribution of it can also shift. So it could mean that you went from a side that didn't have any visible cyanobacteria to having a much more of a thorough mixing, I guess, of those. So once you have a confirmed cyano-HAB, the fastest treatment is typically a chemical herbicide. And so you can see pretty impressive pictures online of before and afters with that, but there are a few really important things to keep in mind with this. In New Jersey, only certified pesticide applicators can apply aquatic herbicides. Now, South Carolina has some exemptions for people who do have private ponds, so they are a little bit more lenient with that, but I didn't see those same exemptions for the New Jersey use of aquatic herbicides. So as far as I know, you need to have a certified pesticide applicator applying any aquatic herbicides. They should be pretty familiar with the rules and how they work, but you might want to know a few things that would be helpful as a property owner who may be hiring someone to pay for that. So as I mentioned, pesticides tend to be pretty fast acting, but they do provide pretty short-term results. Once that chemical loses effectiveness, which may happen after about 48 hours or so, the algae, cyanobacteria, or some other type of vegetation could begin growing again. So it is something that gives you kind of a breather, but it's not something that's going to keep in the long term. Also, if you have a water body that has a lot of water movement through it, then you need to especially be cautious about applying that aquatic herbicide, because some of it will likely wash downstream. That means it's not going to work for you in your pond in particular, and it could damage someone else's resources downstream as well. So you do want to be cautious with that. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are some water quality parameters that are really important, and they impact the toxicity of specific pesticides. So your professional who is applying this should be familiar with that, and hopefully can perform those water quality tests just ahead of application to make sure that they are following appropriate measures based on the existing water quality conditions. The last thing to keep in mind in particular with using chemical herbicides is that if you use a pesticide repeatedly, it can lose effectiveness. So again, it's another reason why it's just important to not totally rely on these. They are really important and useful tools, but they're not a fix-all. Okay, so after you've treated a bloom though, there's typically two things that will happen. So obviously the cells will die. If there were toxins within the cells, when that cell membrane ruptures, then all of those toxins will then be released. So what we usually advise people is that they should expect that toxicity levels will spike within that water body following the treatment of a cyanobacteria bloom. Preliminary information seems like about 14 days or so is when you could expect those cyanotoxins to start naturally decomposing. They also could wash down. If you do have a lot of flow through there, those could wash out of your pond in particular and move downstream. Now, this is a spot where potentially using one of those do-it-yourself test kits could be really helpful to help you determine when you might be able to move livestock back into a pasture and access this water body again. Again, it's very important to know that the do-it-yourself kits only test for limited cyanotoxins. So you would want to make sure that those aligned with the expected cyanotoxins from the species that you had growing in your pond. The other thing that, let's see. Whoops, sorry, I'm going backwards. The other thing that happens after treating, and this happens when any aquatic plants die, is that as those dead plants begin decomposing within the water body, they reduce the dissolved oxygen levels in that pond. And that can be really harmful to fish and to other aquatic organisms. So if you have a fish pond and that's really important to you, you may want to go ahead and take some protective measures by either treating potentially only a portion of the bloom at a time, or you might want to consider adding aeration to help support healthy dissolved oxygen levels. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about aeration in a few minutes as well, but it's important to note that aeration, a lot of people, when we talk about this, they picture the floating fountain that, takes the water from the surface and puts it up into the air, and it's pretty to watch. But aeration is actually different, and it's pumping air from the surface down and releasing it towards the bottom of the pond, typically through some sort of a bubbler. So you have bubbles that are coming up, and that's helping to move the water from the bottom of the pond to create a little bit of a current or movement. It helps to prevent that stratification of your pond layers, and it can help do a couple of other things that are beneficial in the long run. As those bubbles move up, it's more surface area with the water, and so it can help increase the dissolved oxygen within that water body as well. So there's several reasons why aeration can be helpful, but in particular, after you've treated for cyanobacteria or for any other large aquatic plant growth, it can be particularly protective of your fish populations. Okay, so let's say you've gotten the bloom under control and that your pond looks pretty good. Now what? It is not time to rest. It's really important to take some additional action to go ahead and start preventing future blooms. If we move back and just revisit our main drivers for cyano-HABs, then we can take a closer look at what possible actions we can take to help reduce those risks. So again, nutrients, specifically phosphorus and nitrogen, that sunlight and warm temperatures, and then our stagnant water. So looking at the big picture of ponds, South Carolina actually doesn't have natural ponds here, so all of ours are constructed. New Jersey, I think, has some natural ponds in the more northern part, but many are constructed throughout the state as well. And when we construct a pond, or even some of our natural ponds, can change over time. So when we build it, it starts out typically without any sediment build up on the bottom, but nature will often quickly start beginning to fill them back in. Over time, if there's a lot of erosion upstream, a pond can revert to either a wetland or a forest, and this aging process can happen quickly or slowly depending on what's going on the land throughout the watershed that drains into the pond. Now, once a pond has that significant sediment accumulated, it will usually support more aquatic plant growth because it's shallower water that can warm up more, so it's typically a little bit warmer. And then the water or the sediment on the bottom typically is pretty nutrient rich, so it's going to be hard to not have any type of plant growth. And the combination of those factors often will favor cyanobacteria growth as well. So looking at a lot of times when people call and they say, well, I need to know how to fix my pond or what to do about my pond water quality. And they may be surprised when I start with saying, let's look at what's happening on the land that drains into your pond and really start talking about land-based actions first. Those are typically our first priority because it's kind of, you've got to stop the bleeding coming into the pond before you really start looking at the pond in more detail. So again, nutrients, they drive plant growth. That's true in our yards, in our farm fields, and also in our waterways. And while they are essential, high levels can cause significant issues. So let's look at the main nutrients of interest again in our freshwater bodies, are nitrogen and phosphorus. And there's typically 4 main sources of those: fertilizer, sediment, human waste, and animals. And we're going to briefly touch on each of these. So with fertilizer, it's a pretty obvious source. We literally apply it to our lands and to our plants in order to get those plants to grow. When you use that fertilizer, those first 2 numbers are nitrogen and phosphorus. The higher those numbers are, the more of those nutrients that are included. And so it's important to make sure you're looking at that, and then have your soil sampled before you add any fertilizer to your land, and you can get some specific recommendations for what fertilizers you might need, how much fertilizer you need based on your specific soils and the crop or plants that you're planning to grow. This can help keep your costs down, and it better protects water quality. Fertilizer needs also vary depending on if a plant is dormant, growing, or recovering. So be sure that you're applying fertilizer at the best time for your specific plant. You also want to check the weather and then avoid applying it just before a rainstorm. If water runs off of your land just after you've applied fertilizer, it could carry those nutrients right along with it. Now, sediment, some erosion and sedimentation is natural, but there are many activities such as land clearing that can accelerate this movement of soil. And when sediment ends up in our waterways, it can do a few things. It can damage our aquatic habitat, clog infrastructure, and it also can transport other substances. One of those substances is phosphorus, which is naturally present in our soil, and that phosphorus actually binds to soil particles. So when we have erosion and the sediment is carried into waterways, it's likely bringing phosphorus with it. So if you have a pond and you're looking at it, check out any streams that feed into that pond just after a rain event to see if any seem to be carrying a high sediment load. Hopefully none look like the one on the left side of this picture, but if they do, that certainly is an indicator of the direction that you might want to move to check out if you have some erosion problems. Now, sources of erosion can be really obvious, especially if you see evidence of channeling or those water rills, but sometimes the erosion might be happening pretty far upstream in areas that may seem far away from a specific water body. So using a website like Google Maps to look at aerial or satellite photos can help identify areas with erosion problems. And here are a few examples. This is a largely forested watershed that seems like it's in really good shape, but we do see that we have a sediment problem in this particular pond. So when we start looking at this aerial, we can see that we've got a logging road that shows up for us pretty red. We've got this red clay down here that makes it a little bit easier in aerial photos. But we can see that logging road, and we can see some areas within either a pasture or a field that look like they have very little vegetation. If these are areas that you have legal access to, you might want to visit them to get a better look at what's going on the ground and start thinking about some best management practices to start reducing some of that erosion from those areas. If it's a dirt access road, there are some examples for reducing erosion shown here. These are the South Carolina Forestry Commission, I know, has a lot of other information about this. I'm sure the New Jersey Forestry Commission does as well. So that would be something that getting those roads stabilized can help with you being able to access your property, and then also with protecting water quality. In other situations, you might want to establish vegetation to cover soil or sloped areas, or in fields or pastures. Native grasses provide excellent erosion control, and they can be used as ornamental plants that require very little maintenance. They also can be grown from seed if you're trying to cover a large area. That can be a good way to start establishing a real stand of native grasses. It's also important to limit livestock in waterways. So we've talked about how it's better to protect the livestock health, especially if you do have a cyanobacteria bloom, to remove those livestock from that pond. But livestock can also cause a lot of erosion and damage to water bodies. So fencing them out of those waterways can help establish a better vegetation along the stream that will help hold those banks in place. And it's also will typically improve or protect the water body itself. Livestock waste will also have nutrients within it and some bacteria. So getting them away from that water body means that there's not a direct discharge anymore directly into that water body. If you can't fence livestock all the way out of your water body, maybe it's just not feasible for some reason to put in that alternate water supply, sometimes reducing access to waterways, so just giving them a more limited area where they could enter the pond or a stream can be helpful, because then you can use some techniques for heavy use areas, maybe some erosion control mats to help control the erosion within that specific area. And then the livestock typically will also not spend as much time in the water as well. So it can be kind of a compromise as a way to help move towards better health of the livestock and water quality. Having mowed grass all the way to the pond's edge is typically not recommended, with an exception of the dam itself. Instead, we would encourage you to consider establishing a buffer with a variety of plants in order to help prevent erosion. Again, it'll help hold that soil in place along the banks, and then also to help slow and filter stormwater before it drains into your pond. DEP provides some New Jersey specific plant recommendations for reducing HABs, and they do have different lists for North and South Jersey. So if you see their website shown there for more details and specific plant suggestions. So moving to human waste. So humans eat food for the nutrients, but we don't use all of the nutrients in that food that we eat. So some of it will pass through into our wastewater. And that means that wherever there's wastewater discharged, it could be adding nutrients. This can include after a wastewater treatment plant, from a sanitary sewer overflow, or from a septic tank that may not be fully functioning. So be sure to have your septic tank regularly maintained, and then have it repaired if you notice any problems with it. If you see an overflowing manhole somewhere, be sure to report it. That will help your sewer provider quickly identify potential problems within their system, and that helps them get them fixed more quickly. Animals' waste also contains nutrients and can often be carried into waterways by stormwater runoff. Canada geese can be a huge source of bacteria and nutrients, so avoid anything that might encourage them to become long-term residents in your pond. Picking up after your pet can keep nutrients and bacteria out of your pond. We've talked a bit about fencing livestock out of a pond, providing that alternate water supply, better for the livestock, better for water quality. And then feral hogs are invasive. They're present throughout much of the East Coast. They eat everything. They can dig up large areas, and they also cause significant erosion. They reproduce rapidly, and they're difficult to control. So if you do have them in your area, check with the New Jersey, I'm guessing you have a Department of Natural Resources for, any hunting permit requirements. In South Carolina, they're one of the few species that can be hunted freely. There's no season, and there are no limits on them on private land. So it's really more an effort to try to control them than to manage the actual hunting of them. So we touched on aeration earlier. Again, this is with a bottom diffuser. It helps improve dissolved oxygen. It can also help by having oxygen towards the bottom of the pond. It can do a couple of things. It can help keep that phosphorus bound to the sediments that are within the pond. And it can help prevent cyanobacteria cells. There are specific cells that can that they form when they are becoming dormant, and they can settle into sediment, and they can survive for, I think, up to 70 years or so. They often will germinate when there's a lack of oxygen. So having oxygen towards the bottom may be helpful in reducing their germination. Now, it's not guaranteed, but it is one potential strategy. You do want to consider the pond size, depth, shape, water flow, and then also often, and for our ponds, they're pretty rural and there may not be a power supply nearby. So we are starting to see more people use small solar panels to power the aerators. So once you've slowed the flow of sediment into a pond, now you may want to really look at handling what's already accumulated within the pond. Significant accumulations, as we've touched on, they can increase the potential for aquatic plant growth and cyanobacteria blooms. So you may want to consider dredging to restore the pond to their original design conditions. Now, dredging is a pretty big project and it's often expensive. It often requires permits, federal and probably state, and it temporarily interferes with the use of the pond. But removing that nutrient-laden sediment and restoring the water volume capacity can lead to some long-term improvements in the water quality and the health of the pond itself. We do have a relatively new series of articles about ponds. They're published through Clemson's Land Grant Press. So these, we tried to consolidate a lot of information in order to provide some broader overviews and kind of link some of the other materials that we had. So there are a lot of links to other fact sheets. So it kind of tells the story a little bit, hopefully a little bit more clearly. There is like one to point out, since I just mentioned dredging, there is an article that talks about dredging. And so it does point out some of the potential needs for permitting and some of the other considerations if you're interested in that. I've mentioned a couple of times Clemson's Home and Garden Information Center. We do have numerous fact sheets on there. Here are a few of the ones that tend to be fairly popular. Again, a reminder, we do have one on the chemical control of aquatic weeds. The rules around that is a little bit different in South Carolina. So just as a reminder, you need a certified pesticide applicator to apply those aquatic herbicides in New Jersey. Rutgers also has some educational materials and outreach on their extension website. So there's one particularly on lake and pond management that talks about some of the same features that we've covered tonight. And with that, I'd like to thank Southern Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education, Southern SARE, for their grant funding that allowed our team to really dive in and work on this harmful algal bloom educational material. And thank you for your interest, and I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Thank you, Heather. That was really some excellent information. Thanks for providing all that for us tonight. A lot in a short period of time.
I made it through all my slides.
I noticed. Excuse me. Sorry about that. For everyone, I did put some links as we went through in the chat, so hopefully those are usable. And I did start the poll, so if you would, that should pop up either on your laptop or on your phone app. If you would complete that, we'd appreciate that. And we do have some questions. You did mention some of the chemical treatments for harmful algae blooms. Is there anything in terms of like microorganisms or other biological methods that work for that?
So Clemson hasn't jumped in yet on some of the more biological ones. Like we've got some studies that are happening now, but we haven't really weighed in fully on those yet. But there are some other ones like biochar, bioreactors, things that will reduce some of those nutrients can be really helpful. We're getting ready to install like a wood chip bioreactor. And so hopefully we'll have some information about that soon. But there may be some other ones, or Rutgers may have some that they recommend. from a biological perspective. We do allow, again, in South Carolina, the rules are a little bit different. So we allow stocking of tilapia, which is a tropical fish. And so tilapia can sometimes eat cyanobacteria and algae, but in my research, it looked like that was not allowed in New Jersey. So I wanted to be sensitive to that. If any of y'all know differently, if tilapia is allowed, that could be a potential help.
Is there any indication that wearing masks around infected water would help?
That's a really great question, and I don't know the answer to it. My sort of assumption would be probably, but I would want to look at like the size of the potential aerosol drops and kind of what are you doing. What we wouldn't want is for it to potentially land on the mask and then maybe increase exposure. I don't think that would happen, but we haven't looked at that question specifically. So I would think it would probably help in the long term.
You mentioned fertilizer practices in terms of lawns. Would a 4-step program be contraindicated if you're concerned about nutrient runoff?
What do you mean by 4-step program?
A 4-step program is like several of the major fertilizer companies have it, where you buy a different bag, say in maybe April, and one in May, and one later in the season. So you're basically fertilizing during those times, and often they include herbicides.
Okay.
Either a pre-emergent herbicide early in the year or something for broadleaf weeds later in the year.
Okay. I mean, obviously that's not a product that I'm specifically familiar with. What we would suggest to people is to always have your soil sampled before you apply fertilizers in particular. If you're seeing, I know that when you're starting to get into lawn care, we're at the edge of my expertise from the water side of things. But I know there are some like pre-emergents that you may want to put out, and it's important sometimes to prevent some of those weeds from getting started and taking hold. So I think as long as you were applying those with the thought in mind of rain in particular, and kind of keeping a buffer between your lawn and your water body and that kind of thing, responsible application is a big part of it. But then I would also say soil samples can confirm if you actually need what's in the product or not. So
there were several comments about excellent slides and excellent photos, which I'll concur on that. There was a question about sediment in an aged pond. Is it the same as silt?
Yeah, just different terms for it. So yeah.
Okay. Let me see here. There was a question about soil sampling. So in this state, typically the Rutgers Soil Testing Lab does provide soil sampling for a fee, or soil testing for a fee, in terms of, and then it comes with nutrient recommendations for your lawns or gardens. There's a question about neighbors that don't maintain buffers around a water body, that keep mowing and removing vegetation. I don't know if you can address the actual question, which is who would you call to stop them from doing that?
So that question could have a lot of different answers, and it comes down to really state or local ordinances or regulations. So like in South Carolina, we don't necessarily have a buffer ordinance that would require a specific type of vegetation throughout the state. So we would, if it were me, I would need to look at the county where I live, or if I lived within a municipality, and see if there's any legal requirement for them to actually leave that vegetation. There, at least in South Carolina, there's frequently not a legal requirement to leave a certain type or amount of vegetation there. So from that perspective, sometimes the best approach, and even if it is a legal requirement, often the best approach is kind of a friendly education. which I understand can have some complications with it. But if you can help people understand what you're doing, or maybe what they're trying to accomplish, and maybe they don't, a lot of people are afraid of snakes, and they don't want to let the buffer grow because they're worried that snakes are going to grow in there. So in that case, maybe you could help them find some trees or even shrubs that might give a little bit better buffer improvement, while also allowing some visual space, like so you can actually see if there's a snake right beside your foot or something. I know that's not like probably an easy answer that you were hoping for, but it's kind of a complicated situation.
Right. And a related question, maybe in a more of a community-wide viewpoint, how do you take care of creeks and waterways, say on a township level or a watershed level, in terms of the buffers?
Buffers specifically?
So perhaps there's many different landowners.
Yeah.
That could be municipal, it could be homeowners, farms, all sorts of things.
Yeah, so I think outreach and education, in South Carolina, we have a really uphill battle with any kind of regulation or requirement sometimes for water specific things, or for what people do on their private property. So really helping people understand what the risks are to them. In particular, like, livestock farmers may not want to be told what to do, but they want to be told how to protect the health of their livestock. And so if you can evaluate from a neighbor's perspective what their concerns might be. Do they have children who want to play in the water body and they want to make sure it doesn't have harmful algal blooms within it? Sometimes, again, friendly education like that can help people see how a behavior is, how changing a behavior may be more helpful for long-term health. If you wanted to like really kind of look at it from a big picture level, about 70% of our impervious surfaces are for transportation. And so transportation related infrastructure. So where we all live, how we commute to places, makes a really big difference in it, carpooling, or if there's a transit system available, living in a more compact development or in urban areas, like those are really big picture things, but they can make a really big difference in the long term. We did some studies down here that showed that if we changed our growth ratio, so if we just grew more compactly, we could actually decrease some of the impacts to our water bodies by 50% without even doing any BMPs. So, there certainly is a need for specific site-by-site action, but there's also some really big picture supporting planning efforts, supporting transit, supporting some of those things that make a really big difference too.
And there was a comment in the Q&A about the fact that we do have laws in New Jersey. So yes, we do, about some buffer maintenance depending on where it is and what type of water body it is and what you're allowed to do there, and if you're not allowed to fertilize near the water body and those kind of things. So yes, that definitely comes into play depending on the situation. Yeah,
that's great.
One thing we have in New Jersey is laws. So
we do have some in places. We just don't have any kind of comprehensive ones. So
right, it can be rather complicated depending on the situation and the type of water body and the landowner and so on.
Yeah.
I think that's about it for questions. Another comment that it was very informational and interesting webinar.
Awesome.
So we thank you for all the information tonight.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. You've got my contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to try to help you answer them.
I did want to remind everyone to complete the poll if you haven't done so. And next week, we're going to have Bob Schuster from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection talking about water monitoring, which will include, specifically about coastal water bodies, but will include some information on algae blooms there as well. So if you come up with more questions about monitoring and algae blooms, we can try to address those next week as well.